Join me, Mark Windows, for Windows on the World live every Sunday 9 to 11 p.m. GMT. Check out our archive and programme stream at windowsontheworld.net. Good evening, everybody. Tonight we're live from Glastonbury following our successful talks yesterday at the King Arthur pub. What an interesting bunch of people, and a lot of energy was put into the talks and a lot of information exchanged. I'm actually here with Sandi Adams, who was, of course, one of our speakers. What did you think of yesterday, Sandi?
It was a real success. I'm really pleased with it. We had people from all over the country had bothered to come down and listen, and they were a fantastic audience who. We had a lot of input in the Q&A. A very, very switched on bunch, didn't you think?
Yeah, I really like that Q&A bit because lots of things come up, and that's where you start joining the dots, and that's why it's really called The Bigger Picture, because all of the information that comes into me actually confirms and backs up what we're saying, which is very powerful because that also gives you an argument which cannot be refuted. And this is the big thing at the moment, that people have not got an argument. They'll come up with basically their opinions and beliefs, but we don't have much in the way of facts when people are trying to oppose what we're saying, which is a good thing. And the people who came along yesterday, even the people who weren't really aware of what Windows on the World had been doing, or even the information, were coming up to me afterwards and saying, yeah, well, I kind of knew all this stuff anyway, but this is kind of joining the dots and I'll look into it a bit more. So that's why it's worth coming along to the talks. And of course, the amount of information that goes into the talks is kind of immense. So people walk out with a lot of information. But the thing is about it is that then you can go and do your own research. And that's what we actually recommend everybody does. Don't take our word for anything we say. Go and look at it yourself, and then you could be able to come back and say, yes, it's true, and I'm armed with the facts. That's important, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And that's exactly what I said at the beginning of my talk. It was, we're here to help you join the dots. And, you don't have to believe anything we say. But it is about joining the dots because the subject is so vast and so many people, they don't put it all together because it is one massive agenda, but it's got various branches that don't necessarily appear on the surface to be related, but actually you dig deep and they are.
That's the whole point, yeah, of calling it the bigger picture. I mean, when I started looking into this stuff years ago, I've always wanted to be able to encompass it all. I mean, I remember reading books by researchers such as David Icke, but pre that, there was so many people putting this together. But it's the overview where everything comes together that's important, isn't it? And I think that's something that freaks a lot of people out because it completely changes their worldview. But to me, that's where it becomes interesting. And a lot of people seem to take it very personally that they've been, in their words, fooled, but it's just a misunderstanding of how the system works. And that's what I like to put over. It says, this is nothing personal. This is let's look at it as a business plan. Is it a successful business plan? Yeah, it seems to be, but it's pretty flawed in a lot of different ways. Now, I haven't really got a background in finance or business or anything, but when you actually put it down to this and these kind of terms that are kind of impartial, I think it's really helpful. What do you think?
No, absolutely. And people are beginning to put things together and find their own way and do their own research. And I found, I've been banging on about Agenda 21 since, for 10 or more years now, and people really kept thinking I was some kind of tinfoil hatter and that I was mad and that it was all a conspiracy theory. And now people are coming back to me saying, look, and a lot of it's, the 5G thing has really woken people up because they're understanding that it's really bad for you, but not joining the dots to where it's leading. And if you can put that one in the frame and say, well, actually, it's a whole AI agenda that has a very, very much bigger sort of aim and end game. People are now thinking, oh my God, now I know what you're talking about.
Well, that's it. I think that putting all that together, that 5G thing has actually brought things into perspective, I think.
Yeah.
And because it's untested technology, it's completely unknown. But what people have been saying to me, even people who really do know what they're talking about, they're saying that, yeah, it is very dangerous. And I think this is actually bringing a lot more people on board with looking at the other stuff. So in other words, 5G is a bit of a dot connector, isn't it?
It is. Because people are wondering, well, why would they bring in a technology that's actually very harmful to us? Surely that can't happen. And they're beginning to realise that actually maybe there is a sort of an agenda that doesn't have their best interests at heart. And I think that's the most worrying thing for people is it's a bit like, realising that your parents are axe murderers. You've got to come to terms with the fact that actually there are bodies of people who don't actually have our best interests at heart, and we have to know that, understand it, and decide what to do about it.
Yeah, I bring this up in my talk, and it's called the public interest, and a lot of people think that their interests are what the public interest is all about. Well, the public interest is merely a term and an agenda, which judges use especially to actually shut down things that are not in the public interest, which is... Now, the dog obviously doesn't agree with me. Now, this is the first time that Louis has not agreed with anything I've said all day. I'm really quite disturbed about this. In fact, I think he might be a bit of a... Is he an infiltrator?
I think he is.
I think that dog's an infiltrator.
He's a bit subversive, isn't he?
Yeah, I'm really, really disappointed that he'd do that on air, because we've been getting on great today. And... he's been offering his paw and all the rest of it. So, yeah, well, what are the chances of being live on air and this happening? So, ladies and gentlemen, you can tell it's actually live. And, yes, we're at a secret location somewhere in Glastonbury. But, yeah, I was talking about the public interest. The public interest is a really interesting concept because what it's actually about is judges will say something's not in the public interest. Well, the reason they say that is it's not in the public's interest for them to know about it. And that's the important thing here. In other words, if something's not in the public interest, then it might be that it's going to destabilise society, and that's not in the public interest. So, in other words, for people to know that the society doesn't work the way they think it does, it's not in their public interest to know that. It's not in the public's interest to know that the police are involved in crime farming, for instance. It's not in the public's interest for them to know that the police have been no-criming up to 24,000 crimes in Kent and basically failing to investigate 16,000 crimes in the West Midlands. It's not in the public interest for them to know that. However, that is out there because these government bodies, the HMIC, have actually stated this, and the PCC who investigate the police and put this stuff out. But the point is, if that's what's going on, then that's obviously the tip of the iceberg, because this stuff would be vastly underestimated by the internal procedures within the police force. So things like this and certain court cases are against the public interest, even though the public would believe that they are in the public interest. And I think that's a really important thing, and that kind of turns things around a bit, and it explains to people that there's a double meaning to this,
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it is a whole sort of legal thing, isn't it? This public interest thing, where it's some things are withheld from us because it's not in the public interest for us to know about them, and that is quite worrying, actually. And I think that this is all bubbling up with the 5G because the telecoms people seem to be making all the money on it, and they are, really quite, they're ruthless. They just want to make money out of it. And and unfortunately, there's so many people with fingers in the trough or noses in the trough and fingers in pies that they're all bought and paid for because they've got investments in it. And this is something we've really, really got to stand up against.
Yeah, I was going to get on now to the rollout of what is happening and how it's getting easier to spot. And we've kind of, in the introduction, we've got into that. So moving on, there's a ramping up of the carbon trading taxation agenda, which has been going on recently. And it's known to those who repeat things without thinking as the climate change emergency. Remember that The Guardian has ramped up its language on this, but it's actually dumbed down its so-called journalists even more. Now, this declaration of climate emergency, this these declarations that these people are making is still not coincided with the actual climate emergency. So this is kind of the real basic point about a climate emergency, is there isn't one, because you can announce something, but it's only an emergency if it happens, right?
Yeah.
So it does appear, though, that after NASA and NOAA have been found fiddling with data and engineering a rise in global average temperatures, this does actually coincide with the ramping up. Now, this is absolutely disgraceful, and a lot of the people who promote the climate change agenda will deny that this is a fact because it's the post-truth world. But this is actually mainstream news that NASA have fiddled with the data and been altering temperatures up to 2.5 degrees to make them higher than they actually are. And I think this dog is a climate change believer.
I think he is. He's got a lot to say about it, hasn't he?
Yeah, well, I think he's been hanging around with the wrong dogs, you know. And Eric's just said maybe he's from Barking Council, ha ha, you know. But there are many subversives even in Somerset. So moving swiftly on. So to coincide with the UN business plan of taxation for all due to global warming, that they are genuinely concerned about something which could quite literally start a real emergency. Now, the thing is about this, that NASA are rightly concerned that the world could be hit by a comet or asteroid which would wipe out pretty much everything if it collided with the Earth. Now, this would be a real climate emergency, wouldn't it, you see?
It certainly would.
And the 12,800 years ago, it is believed that a comet collided with the Earth. But according to researchers, data suggests that the disaster did happen when Earth collided with fragments of a disintegrating comet that was roughly 62 miles in diameter. Now, this is a much greater threat than CO2, isn't it, really? Now, the remnants of which of this comet still persist within the solar system to this day. Now, there was a writer called Comins Beaumont in the early part of the century who was talking about this climate catastrophophobia, which was caused by cometary impacts. It's really interesting, but this article carries on. The hypothesis is that a large comet fragmented and the chunks impacted the Earth, causing this disaster. This was from emeritus professor of physics and astronomy, Adrian Malott. This is an American guy. Now, this is where climate catastrophophobia had its origins, which is still in the memory banks of Homo sapiens of today, and why the apocalyptic cults attract so many. This is why I believe that people are so willing to believe in this, because it comes from the past apocalypse, what they call or label catastrophophobia. But using climate catastrophophobia as something to blame humans for and demonising CO2 as a business plan is a pretty new idea. This is a new interpretation of it. This is just something I'm sort of floating as an idea tonight, yeah? In the past, it was used for control of minds through religion. Now, nothing like the threat of an apocalypse to keep the citizens in line, is there really?
Absolutely, which is what the first global revolution was about, wasn't it? You have to actually create some kind of enemy, Yeah,
and the chance of the catastrophic predictions coming true are about as likely to happen as David Attenborough telling the truth, right? This is a point. It's quite important, but the chances of a comet hitting are much more likely than anything the UN said, because nothing that the UN have ever said has actually ever come true. But it's a very serious event, this idea of a comet hitting the Earth. And it's the actual interpretation of an apocalypse, it says, is a very serious event resulting in great destruction and change. And from the Bible, it means the total destruction and end of the world. So this is why biblical prophecy is so important with all this. But so the real threat of a comet hitting the Earth eclipses the lame excuses of the UN and the premature declaration of climate emergencies. But a bunch of privileged cult members known as Extinction Rebellion have been gluing themselves to buildings and doing yoga on Westminster Bridge to appease the god of bad weather. Now, will this stop an apocalypse? But it may or may not, but it could result in even more damage and even more die-ins at Waitrose. I mean, what do you think about that?
I mean, having more die-ins at Waitrose, I mean, why don't they go to Lidl? This is what I ask myself. They seem to, concentrate on dying in Waitrose. But haven't they misread the document that their whole organisation relies on?
Yes,
the
it's
SR15
the SR15 from the United Nations IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now, you can look this up, and I've actually told people about it, and they've looked it up and found it straight away. And they've gone, God, I didn't know that. So if anyone's in this Extinction Rebellion death cult, just look up the author of IPCC SR15 document criticises and refutes Extinction Rebellion's interpretation of that document on the grounds that they are basically telling lies. Now, that's really important because the foundation document of Extinction Rebellion is the Special Report 15, which they have totally misinterpreted. And misrepresented is a better word. Yeah. But moving on now, there's more bad news for fact lovers this week. In Bristol, a huge mural of the PR puppet and less than engaging public speaker, you know the one, the pigtailed pop idol whose recent hit Our House is on Fire is still at number 1 this week. Are you getting anywhere? Does anyone know what I'm talking about yet?
What St Greta you mean?
Yes, it's St Greta Thunberg, whose portrait has been painted on a building in Bristol by another self-publicist who would have been better off gluing themselves to a door or joining a much-needed die-in at Waitrose. Yes, the huge mural of Greta the Great features her nearly underwater but still able to breathe in a sea with a backdrop of snow-capped mountains and a polar bear swimming around her submerged in the water. And she's got this raincoat on. And it was unveiled with no sense of irony in the UK's first smart city, Bristol.
Bristol.
Yes.
Bristol is open. That's what the company's called that's heading up the smart city AI for Bristol. Yeah.
Absolutely. And the fella who's actually involved in the rollout of that announced it from his iPhone or his mobile phone by videoing himself talking to himself in a pub about it, and it's had about 100 views.
Well, I'm surprised he wasn't talking to a lamppost, because that came up in my talk yesterday.
Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, it's quite interesting that there's a lot of AI going into Bristol to support the whole smart city thing. And they've got obviously it's going to be all covered by the Internet of Things, a big radio frequency mesh going around the whole city. Driverless cars have been tested, sensors on lampposts. But something, when I was doing my research the other day, something came up, and there's a company called Hello Lamppost, and they are putting into Bristol interactive street furniture that you can have conversations with. And at first I thought, this is absolutely ridiculous. Is this trying to get people to buy into, they're calling it Bristol is going to be a playable city. This is it making infantilizing, human beings basically to talk to and have conversations with street furniture, which seems like good fun to a lot of people because they talk to Alexa, don't they? They talk to Alexa in their own homes. But this is spyware, and it's really, really sinister. Do look it up. It's called Hello Lamppost, and it's also about the Bristol being a playable city. Look it up because it's very weird. I find it really weird. Don't you, Mark?
I mean, I'm just thinking of that old George Formby song. You'd probably get arrested if you sung that near a lamppost.
I'm leaning on a lamppost at the corner of the street.
In case a certain little lady goes
by. He plays it with a ukulele.
Yeah, you'd get done for stalking now, wouldn't you?
You would. and the weird thing is that the lamppost would sing along with you, I think. This is the weird bit, yeah. Yeah,
well, it was announced in Waltham Forest years ago about lampposts that would be listening. And it's all put out there as a good thing. Yeah. And you think, well, why would anyone even consider it was a good thing? This is the worrying thing, but it's a bit of a reflection of the times we're in. And I'll have to go back now to the UK Guardian, and it's once again excelled itself with an article from one of their stable of overprivileged scribblers who are unable to research or think for themselves, just for a change. This one's called Sonia Soda, and she announces, sin taxes on meat or flying won't change a climate hypocrite like me. Rationing might. So, Sonia, you are this week's useless eater and win the Climatard Award for deep state idiocy and usefulness to the World Bank. Now, the scribbler states in her article, only radical solutions will make us reduce our carbon footprints and help the planet. Meat production accounts for more greenhouse gas emissions than all the world's cars, ships, trains and planes. A favourite sport of the anti-green lobby, she continues, is hunting out the climate hypocrites. It's Emma Thompson's lifestyle that has most recently been the subject of frenzied scrutiny after the actress addressed the Extinction Rebellion protests in London a few weeks ago. Emma Thompson, the first-class hypocrite, blared one tabloid headline last month after she was spotted dining on beef carpaccio while flying first class to New York. So, well, let's take apart this statement from the Greta Thunberg school of critical thinking, right? Firstly, Emma Thompson is not a hypocrite. She's a narcissistic, show business, shallow-thinking, publicity-seeking self-publicist who will latch onto anything which brings her publicity. Secondly, she's a script-reading actress and is following the script created for her by a group who are there merely to impose draconian legislation on behalf of the powers that be, which is increasing taxation on the back of a lie called global warming or climate change. So, the point is about these so-called journalists is they never do any research. And this carries on anyway, because I want to get your comment on this in a minute. If the author of this piece or Emma Thompson herself actually researched anything about the subject, they would not be setting themselves up for public humiliation and ridicule, which they clearly are. So it carries on. So this woman, Sonia Soda, she says, so before I say any more about the lifestyle changes required to avoid catastrophic climate change, I'm going to hold up my hands. I'm a climate hypocrite. I care about the climate emergency. Now, what climate emergency is that then?
There is none.
Exactly. So when I decided I couldn't support Labour in the European elections because of its Brexit positions, I voted Green instead, which this is exactly what the destruction of the two main parties was meant to achieve. Is this a conspiracy theory? No, it happened. Over to you on this, Sandy, because this is what we've been talking about over the weekend.
Yeah, over the weekend. I mean, it seems obvious to me now, having seen the two major political parties in our country self-destruct. I mean, Theresa May has successfully destroyed the Conservative Party and I cannot understand, I still don't understand why the 1922 committee didn't actually stop her from doing so, which they would have normally done in any event, if it was any other Prime Minister or if any other period in time. And Jeremy Corbyn has effectively destroyed his own party by not really understanding the will of the people or either of them taking any notice of the will of the people. And what's happened is that it's almost as though they've deliberately self-destructed these two political parties in order to usher through the green agenda, which we know is vast. It's a huge agenda, as we know, to enslave humanity. And in the entire world, every resource on our planet, and this is and with Greta Thunberg and the rise of Extinction Rebellion in the last 6 months, year, whatever it is. I mean, to be honest, it's been the last 6 months. It's really ramped up, and it didn't happen. You know, the Greens didn't actually win the European election because Farage derailed it, but. It happened in Germany. Their two political parties have gone down, their major political parties have gone down, and the Greens did get the European vote, the European election. So it seems, well, Mark agrees that it's almost as though this is actually been constructed, and it's obvious now, isn't it?
Well, yeah, you have to look at who benefits, and the Green Party benefited. Yeah. Now, why would a party which wants to remain in power let Theresa May do what she did, and why would she do it if she was in power? These are the important questions. And Jeremy Corbyn had so much public support. It was incredible. In fact, he would have won an election 6 months ago. Yeah. And look what's happened since. He's absolutely allowed himself, in my opinion, to be completely undermined and controlled by lobbyists around him. And what do we get now? We get the likes of Jess Phillips being promoted and told by a TV producer that they're going to make a film about her life. This is the post-truth world. You couldn't make up how ridiculous things have got, because Corbyn was being promoted basically as the Labour version of Jesus. You know, he had the same sort of following in a way, right?
Yeah.
Now, how can anybody let that slip without saying a word about it and without actually appealing to the public or getting rid of these treacherous parasites around him, unless there is something else going on?
There's a darker shadow sort of government controlling all of this, as we've always known. But this is patently obvious now, isn't it? It's so blatant that, you know, it's there right in our faces.
This idiot carries on anyway with this article, because I'm just... The Guardian never ceases to amaze me in its stupidity. It is stupidity, isn't it? But it's willful stupidity. They love being stupid.
Yeah.
She says, I already know we're fast approaching a catastrophic climate tipping point. Well, how does she know that? She's not a climate scientist, and nobody has actually even said that.
No, she's read it on Facebook.
Oh, yeah, of course,
That's what she's done.
Yeah, well, maybe she heard it at a die-in at Waitrose.
Probably.
Where she bought her beef carpaccio. Oh, no, she had that on the plane, didn't she, in first class? I mean, and fancy, like, saying, you know, I was eating this in first class. I mean, it's absolutely reprehensibly virtue-signalling, vile nonsense behaviour. You know, in other words, I can afford to fly for example. Now, the point is that people writing trivia, maybe it's a new word, trivial, right? Trivial. I've just invented a new word.
Trivial.
Yeah, this trivial crap are getting paid enough to fly first class, brag about it, and then admit that they're hypocrites. What is going on? You know, I mean, every time I pick up that newspaper, I do it because I can't believe how far humanity has sunk. And if there is an apocalypse, then I hope these people are going to feel the wrath of the gods first.
Yes.
They do deserve it, don't they?
Yes, they do.
You know,
they do.
Whereas, you know, honest journalists like us, people putting their heart and soul into the good of humanity, we're getting nothing, are we? But bloody barking dogs, you know.
We don't even get paid, Mark.
Well, there is that as well, I suppose, yeah.
We don't get any money.
But
it's hilarious.
But anyone calling themselves a journalist and stating, I know, before repeating an assumption which is not based on evidence or their own investigation should actually be sacked on the spot. But in the new post-truth business plan, in the new post-truth world, this business plan basically needs as many of these classic useful idiots as possible before it falls apart and the gravy train is no more. But she carries on, because I can't believe that anybody would write this. Rationing to tackle the climate crisis could be given a modern-day makeover. People could be allocated polluting credits to cover activities such as meat eating and flying that they can sell and buy in an online marketplace. Now, who was it who thought of this? It was Al Gore, wasn't it?
It was Al Gore. It's all the carbon credit, you know, sort of, you know, offsetting and rubbish.
But who put this into her inactive and minuscule brain is what I want to know. Have you got any ideas? Because she must have read it somewhere and she's just repeated it, right?
She's probably read it in the Green Party manifesto or something. I've no idea.
Well, this is what Henry Kissinger would call a useless eater. But ironically, she's a useful idiot at the same time.
Oh, absolutely.
You know,
yeah.
But the UK Guardian does excel itself in the repetition of propaganda narratives, and it's stable of those who are unable to think. It's absolutely incredible. But have you got anything to say about that before we move on?
Well, it's ridiculous. I mean, offsetting is a ridiculous notion anyway, because you know you can never work it out, and it's a nonsense. The whole thing is a nonsense, and we don't need to do it.
Well, it's a license to pollute, isn't it? That's
absolutely, it's a license to pollute, and we don't need it, and there is no emergency. And she's talking a crock of rubbish, isn't she?
I know, but it's just that they keep doing it, you know. I mean, every day, the UK Guardian, this is this newspaper in Britain, or so-called newspaper, which is meant to be dying. It keeps begging for money, but it never dies. I mean, people think, how long is it going to struggle on?
I wish it would die. Like, maybe it needs to go to Waitrose. It needs to die because they as you say, they're coming out with all this drivel, and these people. I mean, for a journalist, it's so unintelligent. It's really unintelligent.
Well, it's not journalism, isn't it? Because, I mean, I did a journalism course years ago, and the first thing that they taught you was how to write news. None of them know how to write news. They only write what they're repeating as opinion pieces and what they believe and feel.
And there's a lot of feelings in it, and because a lot of it is passionate, stuff that they believe in, but it's not actually factual.
Well, in her case, she doesn't passionately believe in it enough to carry out.
No,
but she's basically saying,
very shallow.
Well, the point, that's one thing, but also it's this assumption that the rest of humanity is going to pay as well. In other words, that just because she can afford it, she assumes everybody else can.
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely vile. However, let's move on to this article by Paul Craig Roberts. He says, on May 28th, I wrote that the Western world is collapsing so rapidly that I am afraid that I am going to outlive it. And he's gone into this article called Whiteness is the New Evil. Now, we've covered this and what it's about, and the whole thing about replacement migration and this creation of the fake far right, which is to demonise people who vote Brexit and all the rest of it. But he carries on. My article was about the rising demonisation of white people that is producing a collapse in their confidence. Inculcated guilt is making whites willing to accept discrimination against them in order to alleviate Arab, African and Hispanic migrants that greedy corporations and witless political leaders have brought into the country basically to exploit them, right?
Yeah.
So this is the racism, it's the exploitation
they're the
of these people.
Yes, because they're bringing in people that can it's cheap labour, isn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. And it lowers the standard of living for everybody,
It's awful.
Yeah. The identity politics, he carries on, of the Democratic Party works to the advantage of darker-skinned migrants who present themselves as the victims of the white-faced victimised. Now, this is where the inverse racism comes in, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
It says, just as Jews discovered the advantage of infecting Gentiles with guilt, so the Arabs, Africans and Hispanics have done the same. Well, I think the Democratic Party in America is really guilty of this. And it's basically this form of racism that they have brought into the United States of America. So it says, carries psychological and emotional collapse is not the only form of collapse underway in the US and Western world generally. There is also economic and social collapse, especially in the United States. Today, America's once great manufacturing and industrial cities such as Detroit, St. Louis, Cleveland, Flint, Michigan, Gary, Indiana, have lost 20% of their populations, largely due to the offshoring of US manufacturing. Now, this is really interesting because these cities and the outskirts of them are like ghost towns, aren't they?
Yeah.
I mean, it's quite scary when you look at it. But it carries on. The social collapse is evident in rising homelessness. Los Angeles, San Francisco and Seattle have large homeless populations that encamp on city streets, parks and upscale neighbourhoods such as Venice Beach. And of course, there's also a huge rise in homelessness in Hollywood. But in Los Angeles, it says feces and garbage in public streets have caused a plague of rats and fleas. Dangerous sanitation conditions have caused medical authorities to predict a major infectious disease epidemic this summer in Los Angeles.
Ah, well, that's interesting, isn't it?
Yes.
We'll have to watch that one.
Yes, epidemics and pandemics have often been predicted and are not too difficult to manufacture either.
Absolutely.
This is the point. So the solution to those who have lost their homes and are now living in these sort of less sanitary conditions, this is my addendum to what he's saying, could be to introduce a plague. Now, this would tie in with the global plan of depopulation. Conspiracy theory? Not really. Remember the bird flu pandemic, which never happened? Do you remember that?
Yes, yeah.
Now, this was interesting because I reported on this, and it was years ago, about 10 years ago, wasn't it?
It was about 10 years ago, yes.
But the World Health Organization basically announced a worldwide global pandemic. And it was on the evidence of a few people that had died in Eastern Europe. Do you remember this?
I do, yeah.
And it turned out that they could have been infected by a vaccination. Yeah, this was a story that came out at the time. Of course, Bill Gates is always talking about this sort of stuff, and he wouldn't be in favour of advocating anything like that, would he?
Oh, good heavens, no.
Bill wouldn't do that, would he? But the World Health Organization never rescinded their pandemic emergency after the bird flu thing. Do you know that?
Yeah,
it was never, ever rescinded for years afterwards. I kept checking. And it wasn't announced after that, but it wasn't rescinded. So they can announce a global pandemic with absolutely negligible or no evidence for one.
And they just put everyone into fear.
Yeah. So, they could easily kickstart another one, real or imaginary. And Bill Gates even predicted one. Do you remember? Bill Gates predicted one about a year ago. Yeah, he said there will be a global pandemic, right? Yeah. And so you look it up, everybody.
Yeah.
But anyway, Paul Craig Roberts carries on. The flea-infested carpets in City Hall, Los Angeles are being ripped out because of fear of a typhus outbreak brought on by rat infestation. Among the solutions being investigated are refuge camps and a rethinking of the policy of taking in millions of people from impoverished and unstable countries. We are impoverishing ourselves without making a dent in world poverty. Good point. For every person the US takes in, tens of thousands remain. Already, areas of the US look and function like India of 100 years ago. Now, this basically, what he doesn't go into is the global action plan of social equity and all this sort of stuff, which is bringing everyone down to that level. Yeah. But this homeless thing is really serious. We were talking about it earlier because 30 years ago, I bought a house for £15,000 and I didn't even think about property, and I still don't in a way. But what we have now is that generations of people who, like, owning a shoebox is a dream that they can never even get hold of. Now, nobody would have thought about that years ago. No. It shows you how our rights and our aspirations have been diminished and taken over. And basically, once you get that mentality, you are a pauper. And that's the thing. It's a poverty kind of situation that they're trying to throw everyone into. And that's what I thought was quite interesting about this article, because it's a little bit like that situation in that John Carpenter film, which I alluded to yesterday, called They Live, which is all about this kind of takeover of all media and indeed the planet. It's a bit like V as well, that thing. But when you actually think about these things, they're not far from the truth, are they? Really? I mean, and They Live was interesting in that this is basically a sort of vision of a dystopian future, but that dystopian future is what Paul Craig Roberts is describing here. That film was made in the late 80s. And the future of that was people living rough, basically, and working on building sites. And this is the sort of thing that you see in these kind of modern cities like Dubai, which are basically using slave labour, So you've got they're building these huge glass skyscrapers and these people in these corrugated iron huts, basically.
Being treated very badly.
That's right, and being imported from India.
And all sorts of awful things.
Yeah, that's why I thought I'd bring up that comparison, because although the article it's not, in my view, kind of complete with what he's saying, it's a really interesting kind of thing about what's actually going on, because this is a global thing.
And what's so insidious about the global action plan is that it's sold to you as equality for everyone, and it's not. The money is clearly going to the top, the 1%, and it's actually creating poverty for all everywhere else. And this is something that we look at in the bigger picture.
Oh yeah,
it's sold to you as equity. Everyone has to be equal, but this is not happening. I mean, you only have to see what's going on in Africa with land grabs and everything. They don't have the interests of the people at heart.
No, and this ties into another thing I was reading this week. Basically, we're going to start seeing the privatisation of the Himalayas. This is another thing.
Yeah, you read that today, didn't you?
Yeah, and there was another article. They're basically saying too many people are leaving too much rubbish on Everest. And, these are the sort of stories that start cropping up before they close things off. And for those out there who think this is a conspiracy theory, book one of our talks and come along and listen to it and question us on all of the evidence, because this is what it's all about. I like to be questioned on this stuff. What I don't like, though, is people who bring their opinions and beliefs and basically start a non-argument. An argument is a legal debate, isn't it? It's like, well, whose facts are right here? That's what's interesting. But To actually digress slightly, I was talking to some people in the high street today, in Glastonbury, and we were out there with Piers Corbyn and basically doing a little mini protest to test the waters because there was a new mayor inaugurated. And we decided to go down there because there was a lot of people who we thought needed to be confronted on their views, especially about things like the Green Party. So, interestingly enough, got chatting to some young people, and they were very, very interested in what I had to say. In other words, when you can actually put across the facts to them about so-called regeneration, about what the green agenda is really about, in a few words, they start listening. And they go, oh, thanks for that. And most people actually were of that opinion that we met. Yeah. There was no radical people shouting us down. I mean, there was a few people who came along who were having a go at people within Glastonbury Council, which is fair enough. That's their right to do that. Everybody has a right to do that. And we now hear that some of these councillors are reporting people for harassment because they've been criticised. Now, these are not the sort of people who should be in public office. If you're in public office, you expect criticism. I get criticism all the time, and I get attacked by people who have no argument against me and basically slander me, libel me, and I have no recourse. Now, if I was in public office, I would be getting the same, if not worse. And I would relish it because that's where you win your argument. Right?
Absolutely, yeah. And they shouldn't be in public office if they can't listen to the other side.
No, it's the cult of victim status. Exactly. It's the Jess Phillips thing. I'm the victim, and I'm going to support victims. I mean, the thing is also that through the show, people come to me and they have the most horrific stories. And they've gone to these MPs and these people in government and basically say, yes, yeah, very interested. As soon as they realise that it involves the massive corruption that's underneath everything, which they're part of, they basically stop responding. And this is the thing, we cannot actually put any confidence in public servants at all. And this is another major thing. And we were talking about this yesterday, that these councils are not getting smaller, they're getting bigger. 4 or 5 counties becoming one council now. Look it up.
The regional councils. Yes. And they're going to have regional mayors, and they'll get further and further away from the people. So you will not be able to address anything that's happening in your town because you won't even have any recourse to the people who you won't know who they are. Because they will be in regional councils and you won't be able to get hold of them and be able to ask them questions about things that are going on in your area.
See, this is where I've got them in the past, is accountability, yeah? Personal liability, which is how I brought down that Grimebusters website in Waltham Forest that basically libelled people, calling them criminals because they dropped a cigarette end, allegedly. Now, all this stuff is going to be removed from the public, and these name and shame things are going to be rolled out everywhere. And I've already brought 2 of them down. If this carries on, we won't be able to do that. And what you'll find is the change agents locally will start attacking you, which has already happened. But this is going to magnify it, in my view. And I'm not paranoid I'm paranoid for a good reason, not a bad one here. Do you know what I mean?
So basically, you'll have faceless you won't know who is making the decisions because they're so far away from the people. And this is something we have to really fight. They call it devolution. They're devolving power to regional councils, and it's happening in America all the time and has happened. And we've got to fight that. We've got to be able to speak to our elected representatives and be able to put our case forward. We are the people. This is why they're there.
Well, that's absolutely right. And it really ties into what we were talking about last week when that Liverpool fan had put a flag outside his house because he's going to Madrid. And they thought it was lowering the tone of the neighbourhood to do that. And they were actually signing themselves the neighbourhood.
Yeah. Now, that's a Stasi, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
That's behaving like a Stasi. It's hideous.
Yeah. And you see a lot of this. Yeah. I mean, I keep track of what's going on in the borough which I was exiled from, Waltham Forest, and the useful idiot Clyde Lokes is still involved in subverting public opinion there. Look on a Facebook page actually called School Streets. You've got 4 or 5 change agents who are dictating policy in local schools and stating that these local schools have to get on board and not let anyone drop their kids off by car. And these are controlling the narrative, and they're getting all the schools on board, and anyone that doesn't get on board is demonised. And these people do not know anything about what democracy is meant to mean. It's a bit like Saskia Kent, the change agent who took over and destroyed Occupy, when she said, this is what democracy looks like. And democracy by that time looked like 12 Marxists and a dog, plus their dragons who shouted anybody down who actually disagreed with them.
Yeah.
You know, and we talk about that in the talks as well. It was funny, actually, because I was looking through old hard drives of film that I took of Occupy years ago and the consensus meetings and all the stuff that Extinction Rebellion have kind of got into in an even more dumbed down and obvious way. So the template has actually got simpler, not more complicated. And that's what they want to do, I suppose, is make everything even more simple so that the narrative is easier to control.
Yeah, and also there's a historical thing here, because there's a lot of people at the moment, because this has been going on for so long, the erosion of democracy, is people actually don't have a memory of democracy. They don't know what it looks like. They don't actually know what democracy
really
is.
Funny point today was when the Coven of Witches came out with the new witch, the mayor of this town, Glastonbury. The witches, the people with the front with the drums who were dressed in their fancy dress costumes were quite good humoured, I have to say. But a woman who looked rather kind of a bit like a Theresa May Women's Institute kind of lady came out and said, "It's a good job for you that we live in a free country."
Not for long, mate.
I know, but people actually believe that. The reason they believe it is because they don't come up against what we come up against. I mean, if they have these people have to live in a bubble to believe that.
Yeah.
But however, they say quite interesting. Finishing off with this Paul Craig Roberts article. He says rising violence is another indicator of social collapse. Over Memorial Day weekend, 42 people were shot in Chicago. Now, Chicago has a lot of shootings anyway, doesn't it? The violent MS-13 gang, formed originally by Salvadoran and Honduran migrants, has expanded its operation from California to Long Island and is now invading the Hamptons. Residents are installing bulletproof windows, steel doors and safe rooms inside their homes for protection. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because in the UK, there is the so-called knife crime epidemic, right, which is frightening the public in London. Now, it would be interesting to find out if there are actually any more knife crimes than usual. Now, the way the police forces in the UK record crimes is in itself criminal, right?
Yeah.
It's criminal. These, like, Kent Police has been rated inadequate, this was in 2017, in recording crimes and failed to record more than 24,000 offences. Now, that's incredible, right?
Yeah.
And in West Midlands, it was 16,000 violent crimes were not recorded. Violent crimes, that's where there's injuries. But on the other hand, you get crime farming. So when they turn up at an incident, they will get as many defendants as possible. In other words, if you're the victim, you will end up as a defendant as well. You know, and this is, but the knife crime thing, I think, has been ramped up for public fear. Now, where it ties in with the American thing is that they're doing it on the back of postcodes, but we don't. London's not on a grid system like America, so the drug dealers there are working in their hood, their neighbourhood, right? And they don't cross into each other's place, and if they do, they get shot or they get threatened, right? Yeah. Now, in London, the postcode boundaries are so kind of ridiculous, and all. And
also, London's been gentrified so much that when I lived in London I lived on and off from 1980 something to 2009, and I lived in Peckham, which was the knife crime capital of England, actually, I think, at the time. But there was still relatively not a lot of it happening by the time I left in 2009, because it had become so middle class. The ethnic cleansing had happened and the gentrification, and actually it had become a very, very different place. And the only people dying were probably today are the people in Waitrose having a die-in.
Yes.
Because, and I'm sure in Peckham now there will be a Waitrose, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I do remember it, actually, in the early 90s.
It's getting so posh now.
Yeah. It was quite rough. My friend used to live down there in Peckham, and I got the British Rail train back one night, and some kids actually set fire to the train.
I mean,
I shouldn't laugh, but it was
It was pretty bad, and I have to say, I moved from rural Kent to back to Peckham, because I lived there. I had two periods of living in Peckham, and I lived there sort of in the 1980s, then moved to Kent, and then moved back in the the 90s, and my children, I brought them back, and they'd only lived in Kent, and they were sort of country bumpkins. And poor loves, they got mugged on the way to school and things. It was it was pretty bad, but they grew up and it's fine, and they had a great time. They love London now. But yeah, it was in those days quite bad. But I'm sure now it won't be the knife, the knife crimes.
Yeah, I think
a lot of London is gentrified now. So
yeah.
the crime, because this is all manufactured, this is all, this is social engineering.
Yeah, so I'm always very suspicious when there's a crime epidemic being reported and why it's being reported, because the police... Or let's go back to what I was saying at the beginning of the show before the dog started barking, what was in the public interest, is it in the public interest to know that there's a knife crime epidemic? Because previously, these violent crimes, as we've just been saying here, have been underreported, right? So why all of a sudden do we get an epidemic of knife crime? Because I know people who live in North London, where there is a lot of knife crime, and they say there's no more than usual. And in fact, there is so much knife crime there that the police will never put it out because it's too scary. So why all of a sudden is this happening? It's part of the social engineering. In other words, Tottenham is about to be regenerated. So they're going to have to clear out people who may be undesirable. Yeah. And the undesirables will be the gangs, of course. Now, the thing is that this stuff it all works together. And once you know how property developers work, this is also a really key point, because property developers, and of course with Lend-Lease and Bechtel basically owning the infrastructure and being given the management of the infrastructure by London councils, these people have great ability. I'm not saying they're doing it. I'm saying they have great ability to be able to influence public opinion through the people who work for them. And property developers are known for this. And Eric Von Essex, who listens to the show, knows all about this. And he's told me what property developers get up to control the narrative. Now, that goes into where they just have PR companies who create fake consultations, basically by getting the useful idiots on board and marginalising everyone else when they want to put a development up. Now, that goes further into the bullying of people who get in their way, and this is well known. So is it possible that all this is being put out there by PR companies and put into Reuters and AP? Yes, it is. It's entirely possible. It's just a thought. Yeah. I'm throwing it out as a bit of conjecture. I've got no proof for that. But having looked at the machinations of how this works, it seems a bit strange to me that you all of a sudden get a crime epidemic when usually they're trying to hide it.
Yeah, so they're doing that in order to have access to more property.
Yeah, and basically, so it brings in this need to get rid of violent crime, which is basically the Agenda 21 thing, where everything's surveilled and more open.
Absolutely.
And they're not allowed, in other words, if the police are chasing one of them in a car, a high-speed car, they've got little chance of getting away because obviously all the roads are closed off.
Yeah. And
this kind of thing. I mean, this is a bit of speculation, but when you start looking at this in the bigger picture, which we do, that's what seems to come across to me that's going on, because there's always been a lot of violent crime in London. I mean, I've witnessed it,
myself too.
Yeah, I mean, really bad things, I mean, I've nearly been stabbed a couple of times. Yeah. And I was, someone tried to rob me at knife point years ago. But the point is that these things are happening all the time. And then they're usually underreported. So I'd suggest there's something else going on here.
So they're selective in what they're doing for some kind of reason, yeah.
Yeah, and I've been given a lot of information recently how the police work. But you see that lady who said to me, it's a good job we live in a free country, if she knew the staggering corruption that's gone on in every level in this country, it's unbelievable. And so-called communist countries are freer than here. There's no doubt about that, because you can still feel free here, but until you get buttonholed, collared about something, and then you realise that basically once you're on a radar, then they can pin anything on you. And this does happen to a lot of people. And if you're a victim of crime, then you can very quickly find yourself as a defendant, as we reported in our shows on crime farming, people coming forward and saying that they'd been violently attacked. The next thing is that the other person is being charged, and so are they. So you get two defendants, which from a business point of view makes much more sense. It makes more money for the courts, and the police are doing less work.
Yeah.
So they have to interview two people. So why would they interview someone who's got a defence? You take the defence away if it's a business, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
And that's all it is. It's a business. It's nothing personal, everybody. For those of you who think there's justice out there.
But it is all a business at the end of the day. You're right. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's what I've come to find, really. And so I think I have to be sceptical about everything. And a big part of the talks we do is explaining all this. And, but most of the public can make this logical connection when it's explained to them, you see. It's all about the way it's put across. And the press can't do that. They don't seem to be able to put this across. I mean, there's a few good journalists, there's a few that are independent, that are good, but the general level of it is so low that it's unable to even convey what we're conveying here in conversation. It just can't do that.
Yeah.
So there's an inability to even analyse, and it's the analytical use of the data and putting it together that's important. And once you start doing it, it becomes quite obvious, really, doesn't it? It really does. So, we had a very good day today, and we've got more talks coming up. And I'm really busy on this audio book and several other things that I want to bring to Windows on the World. We actually did record the talks. They were streamed, but they were basically streamed in the King Arthur kind of environment. Yeah. But we're going to put them out.
Yeah. Yeah, we're going to put them out. I mean, I think you can access them at the moment on the King Arthur Facebook page, King Arthur Glastonbury Facebook page. You can access them now. I don't know how long we keep them up there for, but then we can take the link and put them out on Windows on the World.
Yes, I would think that we could actually get some shortened versions of them and put them out. I mean, don't let that discourage you from booking the talks, because the talks are organic. They're changing all the time to keep up with what's going on. In fact...
And it's moving fast.
It's moving fast. And from Didcot, which was only a few weeks ago, I've had to rethink certain bits of it, because certain things come and go. It's almost like what we're in is it's a media circus, and it's fashion. A lot of this it's as shallow as fashion, isn't it?
Yeah,
what they talk about.
What's happening? I mean, the whole collapse of two major political parties, it just happened almost overnight. And, this is moving very fast. And this agenda is being pushed. And they've, if you look at the history of Agenda 21, every single goal that the United Nations have put out, that they want to have this by this time and that by this date, and, all these different parts of how they want to control the entire planet. They've failed on every single goal that they've had as far as dates are concerned, and they've just pushed the agenda. Now they're really panicking and they're pushing it, which is why I believe that we've had the collapse of two major political parties to try and make way for the Greens, because the Greens are pushing the United Nations Agenda 21 2030 agenda through, the smart city agenda, everything through as quickly as they possibly can, which is what the new Green Deal is, or Green New Deal is about. So, and I talk about that in my talk as well. So we've really just got to be aware of this and oppose it as best we can from the local level, and to stop the 5G. That's a big thing. This week we've found 5G on cows in Somerset. They've got 5G collars on cows so that they can self-milk, and they're testing it out in Shepton Mallet. That was a big revelation, and it's being rolled out at Glastonbury Festival. For us, it's a big thing to get rid of the 5G, which fuels the Internet of Things, which fuels the smart cities. So that's the end game.
Oh, it certainly is, and it's to bring in a good radio quote, that's the end game for us.
That's the end game.
For tonight only, yes, it's the end game for us. It's 9:59,
Wow.
and I've got a lot of stuff that I wanted to get through tonight, which I'm going to archive and put in future shows because obviously been on the road a bit and travelling about. So there's loads of good new information all archived and ready to go, and it's getting added to all the time. So thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll be back at 9 p.m. next week. Check out windowsontheworld.net, look in the archive, and also check the King Arthur Facebook page, and we'll be back 9 p.m. next week. We should be able to be putting out some of the talks as we go along, and we'll be putting them onto the Windows on the World website. That's it from myself and Sandi Adams, and we'll see you all next week.